For decades, this was Ontario's most ambitious dream, a place where technology, architecture, and imagination collided. It was futuristic, bold, and deeply proud of itself. And yet, today, most people pass it by without a second glance. A cluster of white pods hovers above the water, held up by slender steel columns. Their glass walls, once dazzling, are now fogged with decades of neglect. Half a century later, this space is once again at the center of attention, not over architecture or innovation, but over ownership. Is this a revival or the final nail in its coffin? This is not just the story of a park, it's the story of a province trying to define its identity, and how, today, it's risking selling it off. This is the story of Ontario Place. To understand Ontario Place, you have to return to the late 1960s, a time when Toronto, and indeed all of Ontario, believed that the future could be engineered. Post-war prosperity had transformed the province. Factories hummed, suburbs spread. The skyline, once dominated by church spires and chimneys, now bristled with glass towers and cranes. Toronto's growth was unprecedented, its population surging past 2 million people. In this moment of confidence, the province wanted a symbol, something that would show the world Ontario's modernity, its ingenuity, and its optimism. The success of Expo 67 in Montreal had lit a fire. The World's Fair was a spectacular showcase of Canadian innovation, culture, and design. Montreal had captured global attention, and Ontario's leaders wanted something that could do the same, but permanently. The task fell to the Ontario government under Premier John Robarts and to young, ambitious Minister of Education, Bill Davis. Davis imagined a place where Ontarians could come to celebrate their province, its industries, landscapes, and ideas, but in a setting that looked and felt like the future. It wouldn't be just another fairground or park, it would be a cultural statement. But where could you build a future? The answer lay in Lake Ontario itself. Just off the waterfront, a vast stretch of shallow water extended from Exhibition Place. It was an unused expanse, invisible, forgotten, and yet, in the right hands, full of potential. The province hired Eberhard Seidler, a German-born architect known for its visionary designs that blended engineering with art. Seidler's concept was revolutionary. Instead of reclaiming land from the lake, he would build on the lake. He designed a series of 5 interconnected exhibition pods, suspended above the water on steel stilts. Their glass walls reflected the skies and the lake in perfect symmetry. It was architecture as theater, weightless, geometric, and unmistakably modern. To reach them, visitors would cross floating walkways and bridges. Around them, Seidler envisioned artificial islands, gardens, and canals. To the west, he designed an immense geodesic-style dome, the Cinesphere, which would house a groundbreaking technology developed by a small Canadian company, IMAX. The project was audacious, it was expensive, and it was entirely unlike anything Toronto had ever seen. When Ontario Place opened in May 22, 1971, the future arrived on the Ontario waterfront. Crowds lined up to walk across the bridges and into the pods, where multimedia exhibits celebrated Ontario's industries, from mining and manufacturing to design and science. The displays glowed with light and film projections, a fusion of education and spectacle. In the Cinesphere, the premiere of North of Superior astonished audiences. The film, a wordless IMAX experience, soared over forests and rivers, immersing viewers in a scale of cinema they had never encountered before. Outside, Children's Village offered a new kind of playground, sculptural towers, slides, and nets that encourage exploration and creativity rather than passive amusement. It was inspired by the avant-garde playgrounds of Europe, a space that treated children as thinkers, not just visitors. Everything about Ontario Place was a statement. The province wasn't just building infrastructure, it was building identity. In its first decade, more than 3 million visitors came every year. Families picnicked by the lagoon. Couples watched concerts under the stars at the Forum, a circular stage surrounded by trees. The scent of the lake air mixed with the hum of projectors, the laughter of children, and the distant sound of cars. For a moment, Ontario Place wasn't just a destination, it was a feeling. It was what the future felt like in 1971, clean, confident, and full of promise. But the future is a fragile thing. By the early 1980s, Ontario Place began to lose its shine. The world that had created it, optimistic, industrial, forward-looking, was shifting. The oil crisis of the 1970s had shaken the economy. Environmental awareness was rising. The ideal of constant growth and industrial pride that Ontario Place celebrated began to feel dated. The white steel pods, sleek and abstract, required constant maintenance. The lake winds corroded their frames, the glass fogged, the bridges weathered. And the content inside the pods, once thrillingly futuristic, quickly grew stale. What had once been cutting edge in 1971 felt like a time capsule by 1985. Attendance began to decline. The park tried to adapt, introducing new events, exhibits, and entertainment. In 1985, the province opened the Ontario Place Water Park, hoping to revive family interest. It worked for a while, bringing summer crowds and youthful energy. But it also marked a subtle shift, away from the intellectual and cultural mission of Ontario Place, towards something more commercial and recreational. The 1990s marked another change. The Forum, one of the most beloved parts of the park, was demolished. The venue that hosted legendary concerts throughout the 1980s and 90s, from Gordon Lightfoot to the tragically hip, would make way for the Molson Amphitheatre, a larger venue catering to corporate sponsorships and big-ticket acts. It then became the Budweiser stage, and now the RBC Amphitheatre. Bit by bit, the original spirit of Ontario Place, its experimental civic optimism, eroded. The early 2000s brought further decline. The Children's Village, once celebrated as one of the most creative playgrounds in North America, was demolished in 2002. Maintenance costs soared, while attendance plummeted. The pods, once home of many public exhibits, now only hosted private events. The Cinesphere flicked back to life occasionally, but could no longer stand the competition. By 2010, Ontario Place was a ghost of its former self. The life, joy, and innovation that Ontario Place represented were now just a memory. And then, in 2012, the Ontario government made it official. Premier Dalton McGuinty's government announced that Ontario Place would close indefinitely for redevelopment. It was an anticlimactic end. No farewell festival, no ceremony, just a press release and a padlock on the gates. For decades, Ontario Place had represented Ontario's optimism. Now, it was a relic. For years, Ontario Place sat silent. Urban explorers documented the decay. Places where many built core memories were now left totally abandoned or with minimal care. Photographers captured the eerie stillness of a place that was once full of life. To some, it became a symbol of nostalgia, to others, of waste. But Ontario Place was too valuable, too visible, to remain dormant forever. In 2019, the province government under Premier Doug Ford announced bold new plans to redevelop Ontario Place. The proposal promised to restore the site to its world-class status, but it would be in 2021 when the government's intention to Ontario Place would be made clear. The province struck deals with private partners, including Austrian company Therm Group, which proposed a massive luxury spa complex on the West Island. The $350 million facility would include glass pavilions, saunas, and pools, reshaping much of the island's natural landscape. To supporters, this was revitalization, an overdue investment in a decaying property. To critics, it was a privatization of public land. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Architects, historians, and urbanists condemned the plan. Citizens rallied under the slogan, "Hands off Ontario Place." They argued that Ontario Place was built as a public park, a civic space for all Ontarians, not a commercial resort for the wealthy. They warned that the new development would erase the site's architectural heritage, displace the beloved Trillium Park, and restrict public access to the waterfront. The government countered that most of Ontario Place had been abandoned for years and that the new plan would finally bring it back to life. They promised that the Cinesphere and the pods would be preserved, restored, and integrated into the redevelopment. But as details emerged, skepticism grew. Heritage advocates accused the province of downplaying the extent of demolition. The future of Zeidler's pods, now recognized internationally as a landmark of modernist architecture, remained uncertain. The fight over Ontario Place escalated into one of Toronto's most emotional and divisive public debates. Protesters packed City Hall meetings. Heritage Toronto added Ontario Place to its list of endangered sites. Even the descendants of Eberhard Zeidler spoke out, pleading for the integrity of the design to be respected. At the heart of the conflict was a familiar question, one Toronto had wrestled with for decades. Who owns the city's future? The government promised an economic revival. The public feared a cultural erasure. In the following years, despite widespread protests, the province announced that construction would begin. Trees were cut down on the West Island to make way for soil testing. The island was now home of bulldozers. For many, it felt like a déjà vu, another battle over Toronto's identity, echoing the fights of the past, the Spadina Expressway, the Toronto Islands, and the battle to save Union Station. Progress and preservation stood on opposite shores. Once again, Toronto found itself asking what kind of city it wanted to be. By 2025, Ontario Place was a construction site. Fences surrounded much of the waterfront. The future spa, still years from completion, occupied headlines and divided opinions. The Cinesphere remained closed for restoration, its future uncertain but symbolically defiant, a silver dome holding its ground against the tide of change. 50 years after it opened, Ontario Place remains more than a place. It's a mirror, reflecting the hopes and contradictions of the province that built it. When it opened in 1971, it represented a kind of faith in progress, in technology, in the idea that design could make life better. It was a park built not for escape, but for imagination. When it closed in 2012, it represented something else, a reckoning with the limits of that faith. The future, it turned out, couldn't be maintained by optimism alone. And now, it represents something more complicated still, a battlefield over what we value most. To some, the new Ontario Place will be a rebirth, a modern waterfront destination blending wellness, culture, and leisure. To others, is the final betrayal of a public dream, a symbol of how easily civic ideas can be sold, fenced off, and rebranded. But perhaps, in a strange way, that tension is exactly what Ontario Place was always about. It was never just a building, or a park, or a dome. It was a statement about who we thought we were, and who we might still become. Ontario Place is a story of optimism and decay, of architecture and ideology, of a city's restless relationship with its own identity. It began as a dream of the future, became a monument to the past, and now, once again, stand at the edge of becoming something new. As the waves lap against the stilts of the pods and the cranes rise over the lake, one truth remains unchanged. Every generation inherits the ruins of someone else's future, and what we choose to build or preserve defines more than just our skyline. If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Stay tuned for more!